Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at triathletics.com. Today is Dustin May Day, so this is Content-tober. We're coming out with a ton of videos this month, really trying to give you guys a ton of value. One of those things, we're going to do 10 pitcher breakdowns over the course of this month. The first one's going to be Dustin May. So most of you guys have seen highlights of him on Pitching Ninja. He's known as Ginger Guard. He's got a couple other nicknames, but he's a pretty nasty guy. He's averaging over 98 miles an hour with a sinker that has 10 inches of horizontal movement to it. He was drafted in the third round out of high school at 18 years old. He's listed at 6'6", 180 pounds, but I looked it up, and that's actually what he was listed at in high school when he was drafted. So to me, I'd say he's probably closer to 200, 205 pounds if I had to guess. This is actually a clip of him down on the left here from high school. So it does look like he's put on some size from when he was 93, 94 in high school to touching 101 plus at this point. But again, long, lanky guy nonetheless. Great delivery, a lot of good things to learn from, so we're going to break down a couple of things that stand out that he does very, very well. As far as his off speed and just kind of how he pitches, he has a cutter that's running up to 96 miles an hour. He throws his fastball, or his sinker rather, about 50% of the time. He goes to that cutter about 25% of the time. And then the other 25% of the time, he mixes his changeup, his curveball, and his four-seam fastball. So without further ado, let's kind of get into some of his mechanics. Let's see how he's able to throw so hard, what he does well. Maybe there's a couple of things that he could do better. So let's get into the video. So the first thing I want to highlight is his leg lift. Now, what he does very, very well during the leg lift, obviously it's kind of a unique leg lift. There's a high leg kick. It appears to be a lot of moving parts, but again, we're looking at what are the fundamentals that he's doing that correspond to high-level throwers. So what he does really well that allows him to load and get into a good position later on in the delivery is that he's staying in this very tall, stacked position during that peak leg lift. So what that means is if we get to the peak of his leg lift, and again, the exact height of the leg lift is somewhat a stylistic difference, but at the peak of his leg lift, what we're really looking for is the head, that head position, the torso position, and the heel to be in line. So head, torso, we have the pelvis underneath him, we have the heel. Basically, we're looking for this to be a straight line. This is the stack that we talk about. What you'll typically see, just to kind of demonstrate, in lower level throwers, a lot of times during the leg lift from the front, initially you'll get kind of a hunching over position where that head, that torso starts to dip in front of where the pelvis is. A lot of times you'll see athletes that lean too far back. So during their leg lift, they're all the way back here. So they're losing that stack as well. And then if we look at them from the side, which I'll get to the side view in a second, but you also want to make sure that during the leg lift, you're staying stacked front to back. So that tilting of the pelvis as well. You want to make sure during leg lift that you don't lose the stack that way either. It's very, very common in low level throwers is letting that pelvis begin to tip and it begins to become a reach with that front hip. So point being, he's in a very strong, stable position. Got a very stable foot position right here. Weight through the heel, pelvis stacked, head, torso, everything in line here. Now, I mentioned keeping that stack with the pelvis, but that's typically talking more about front to back. Now, if we look at anterior to posterior, he does something that a lot of hard throwers do. You might see like a Nolan Ryan kind of example here as an example of this in his leg lift with how high he gets. And at first it looks like this is happening just because of knee flexion, right? Hip flexion. It looks like he's getting that leg super high from his hip, but what's actually happening is he's only about a few inches above the line of his pelvis with that knee position. So he's somewhere around here with his knee, but what allows him to get that so high is that he's posteriorly tilting his pelvis underneath him. So you can see that pelvic angle. He's really tipping that pelvis back and almost like tucking it underneath him. This is something that a lot of hard throwers do. My current theory as to why that is that it kind of acts as a preloading or a presetting that helps transition from that peak leg lift into the ensuing rotational hinge that we'll talk about in a second. But it's that transition from posterior tilt, stacked, into that rotational hinge is that it almost gives them that extra little bit of a drop into that rear glute. And so not every hard thrower does this, but this is very common to see that pelvis to kind of tucked under the body while maintaining, again, that stack and that center line through the heel. Okay, we can play it through. Video gets a little blurry there, but the very next thing that I want to talk about is the rotational hinge, so we'll get into that next. So the next piece I want to talk about is what we call the rotational hinge, and that's basically as you transition from this leg lift and this initial weight shift into the back leg, into the back glute, we refer to that as the rotational hinge. So that would be this movement from leg lift to right here, where he drops from that stacked tall position, and then he drops into that rear glute. What's actually happening, what's going on here, is that there's a pelvic turning or coiling over top of that rear femur. And so as he drops into that rear glute, he creates a coiling or a tension over that rear femur. And so he's loading tension in that back hip. He's loading what I would consider an internal rotation tension into that back hip. And he's riding his center of mass, his pelvis, forward down the mound from there. So that initial leg lift, again, is transitioning from here. Right about here is when he comes into that back glute. So it's not an active coiling in the initial leg lift. As he comes out of that, he hits the glute and he finds that load position. As soon as he finds that, now he's going to ride that pelvis forward down the mound. And that's this linear move right here. So what's happening right here? He's in the glute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These frames are what I would consider the linear move right here. So what's happening here, just to kind of demo, he's come out of that stack, come out of that leg lift. He's hit the glute, right? He's now in that rotational hinge where the pelvis is turned over that femur, and he's created tension. He's wound tension over the femur. From here, it's riding the pelvis, riding the center of the body forward down the mound. So if we go back to the video, if we look at his belt buckle, that's a good indication of where the pelvis is relative to the rest of his body. His pelvis maintains this closed position. His pelvis is facing third base. And so for this range right here, his belt buckle remains relatively constant. Right there, it begins to open over these frames. But basically the linear move is riding the center of the mass, riding the belly button, riding the pelvis, however you want to think of it, riding a closed pelvis towards the target. That's your linear move. And then from there, we're going to get into that. There's an unload action that takes place. But what I want to use to illustrate this is a video of him from high school. Now, when he was in high school, everything that I could find, I'm just going to let this loop, everything that I could find said that he got up into the mid-90s in high school, but he was a 91, 92, 93 guy, touching 4, touching 5, which is really good, especially for a 6'6", 180-pound kid in high school. But he was not touching 101 plus. He wasn't throwing a turbo sinker. He wasn't doing any of these things. So can we identify maybe a couple things that he was doing differently in high school than he is now, or something that he cleaned up besides just maybe putting on a little bit of size? Now what I think is happening is he really has a poor linear move in high school, and that's something that he either gained through getting stronger and gaining more stability on that back leg, this ability to ride that back leg longer, or he was coached to do it better. But if we get to the peak of his drive, before he begins to open up, it's right about there. If we look at him on the right, the same position is here. And so he's in this very upright angle in high school. He never really gets into that sit, into that back hip as deep as he could, and has this sustained linear move through his center. And here, currently, he's in this much more loaded position, and he's able to ride that further down the mound, building potential kinetic energy that he can then ultimately unload later into the throw. And so just this is a very telling angle that he had to, because he didn't have this sustained linear move, his arm had to take over the throw. And so if we watch just visually how he created that velocity on the left, again, it might be a little harder to see if you have kind of untrained eye, but he's staying very upright and the arm is supplying most of this energy. He's still rotating pretty well, but he doesn't have this linear motion out of the pelvis prior to that rotation. So he's not getting as much as he could out of the lower half on the left, which is a big reason that he's gained 5, 6, 7 miles an hour since being drafted. All right, so let's look at the pelvic load and that linear move from the side, just so that you can kind of see the pelvic actions from the side, kind of understand it a little bit better. We talked about the pelvis not tilting or tipping too early in the throw, because when guys do that, they begin to lose contact with the stable back foot. They begin to lose this stack of the torso over this level pelvis. And so a general rule, and what we look for, is this pelvis not tilting more than about 10 degrees during the forward move. So again, we couldn't find a full delivery side view. This is kind of an abbreviated leg lift with a runner on base. But as he gets into this back leg, what we're looking for is this angle of the pelvis not to be hiked up 30 to 45 degrees. This is super, super common in slower throwers, is that their idea of how to get into the back leg is to lean back and tilt the pelvis upwards. And so to them that feels like they're loading the back leg because they're putting weight on the back leg. But what hard throwers do is they keep this relatively level pelvis, right? If the horizon is right there, he's very, very close to the horizon. So 5 to 10 degrees is kind of that acceptable amount of tilt of the pelvis that we'll see. When you hear guys talk about like the pelvis mirroring the slope, this is kind of what we're talking about, right? This is, the pelvis is dropping in line with the slope, but the pelvis stays underneath the body the whole time. When guys are too far back this way, they're too far forward this way, or their pelvis is tipped uphill too far, they lose the stack and they lose this ability to effectively transmit force from the pelvis into the upper half, right? If you were going to throw a punch, would you throw a punch from up here? Would you throw a punch from back here? Or would you throw a punch with your pelvis tilted? No, of course not. You'd keep this stack of the head, the torso, the pelvis, and you'd rotate everything you could into that punch with your lower half underneath you. And so as he rides forward, we can see that angle maintained. Pelvic angle, pelvic angle, pelvic angle, pelvic angle. So it never gets above roughly that 10-degree line. If you're a coach, if you're an athlete, really take a look at side view and see if you have this same variable in your mechanics, or if this is something that you really struggle with. Because I would say we see this in over 50% of throwers who throw under 90 miles an hour. This is very, very common because they don't understand how to build tension, how to move through the center of their body, how to load the pelvis, and how to unload the pelvis. So now we're going to get into the pelvic unload and what that looks like. But hopefully you understand kind of what this idea of a stacked pelvis or keeping stacked through the delivery means, right? He's stacked through the initial leg lift because he's keeping his head, his torso, his pelvis, his heel underneath him. But as he moves forward, he's still maintaining that stack dynamically so that the pelvis is in a good position to actually transmit that force up through the thorax and into the arm. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's talk about the pelvic unload now. Guys, real quick, if you're liking this video, if you find it interesting, go ahead and give this video a like. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. We're trying to hit 20,000 followers on YouTube by the end of the year, so definitely make sure to do that if you haven't already. All right, so the next point I want to make about Dustin May is how he releases that stored tension in the pelvis, in the back hip, into this rotational unload, or into this pelvic unload into landing. Now, the point of the unload is to take this linear move and turn that linear kinetic energy into rotational energy. So you can't just, this is why triple extending towards the target, this is why just pushing off the rubber as hard as you can doesn't actually correspond to guys throwing harder, is because you're taking this linear move and there's no actual attempt to transfer that into rotational energy. So it's really a combination. Hard throwing is a combination of taking that linear energy, converting it to rotational energy, and then that rotation spiraling its way up in plane, spiraling its way out into the arm. And so, we saw him in high school. He didn't have that linear move. He purely had this rotation, but he still had rotation, which is why he threw 95. But if you can combine the linear aspect with that rotational aspect at the right time, then you can maximize all these different planes, all these different ways to capture as much velocity as possible. And so we're going to talk about how he's able to unload and release that stored energy in the pelvis. So again, just a nasty pitch, 100 miles an hour, probably 10 plus inches of horizontal movement on this one. So we're just going to summarize what we've already talked about. Okay, peak leg lift. He's staying stacked. We already talked about that. Hits the back glute. So he's in the back glute. He's got the pelvis turned over the femur. He's got the pelvis relatively level relative to the horizon. He's riding that forward. So this is his forward linear move right here. Right, that's about 3, 4, 5 frames long. Okay, eventually you get to the end point of that linear move where you can't hold that pelvis closed any longer. You reach the end of your abduction, your available range on the back leg. You've reached the end of what you can hold while staying stacked. You get to that end point, and now that cues this rotation. But it's not firing from the back hip and forcing the back hip through as fast as possible, like a lot of people think. I used to think this myself. I ended up having back injuries in high school, back injuries in college, because I was told, you have to rotate your pelvis as fast as possible. And so it became this thing where I was trying to violently yank the pelvis through as fast as possible. I paid no attention to this loading and holding this connection to the ground on the back hip. So I was just trying to force the back hip through. But he's not doing that. What he's actually doing is he's releasing this energy. We call this relaxing or releasing into rotation, into hip rotation. And so if we examine these frames right here, you can see how free and easy he is through the midsection. So he's actually releasing into rotation. Now this is something that I learned, I've talked about this before, it's something I learned in college, coming back from a low back injury where I was trying to force rotation, is that I was actually initially tentative, scared to throw because my back had just been hurt for 3 months. So I was actually trying to not use my back when I threw. And so rather than forcing my rotation as a block, what I ended up doing accidentally is trying to relax my low back. And so I would let my low back just kind of relax, let the pelvis relax into rotation, open up, keep the front shoulder closed, and then throw. And what I noticed is just coming back through that process, the ball was coming out better. 50%, 60% effort. It's coming out better than I used to be able to throw 80 or 90% effort. And that was because I allowed this energy to transfer its way segmentally. It wasn't forcing rotation as this blocked rotation. It was allowing it to unfurl the whip. The pelvis was able to dissociate from the lumbar spine, from the thoracic spine, from the rest of the delivery, so that you can create this efficient wave of energy. So he releases that energy through the pelvis. The pelvis is now open, and so now it's cueing this tornado-like action where, if you want to look up the spinal engine concept, this is something that we've talked about before, but it's basically cueing this segmental energy transfer up through the spine. Segment by segment, that's how the spine transmits rotation. And so this is how we transmit that linear move into rotation, is he's riding it as long as he can, keeping the pelvis closed. Then he's releasing, he's relaxing into rotation, the pelvis gets open, the shoulders stay closed, and now there's this unwinding action, this tornado-like loop of energy through the thorax, through the thoracic spine. So a little bit of a clarification about what is actually happening during this unload, right? Obviously the cue, relax, release, that's fine. But what's happening is a lot of people think that it's just the back hip internally rotating that cues this motion. If I zoom out, it's actually not just the back knee slamming down and this back hip internally rotating, right? This isn't the action to cue the pelvis to rotate, right? Because what's actually happening is you're already loading into internal rotation during the linear move. So you're already here in internal rotation to some extent, whether you're crazy internally rotated or maybe it's a little bit less, you're already loaded into IR during the linear move, right? So what happens is you've locked the pelvis over the femur in internal rotation, and then into landing, the pelvis initiates the rotation and it brings the back hip with it. So it's not slamming down with the knee. Any of these drills that you see where coaches teach you to slam the knee down, none of that energy actually makes its way into the pelvis. But if you lock the pelvis over the femur and unload the pelvis, it brings the femur with it. And so that's what's happening. That's something that I don't see talked about a lot, but I think fundamentally that's what's actually happening when we talk about a high-level pelvic load and unload. So I just wanted to make that point of clarification. All right, so what's the arm action doing? What's the throwing arm? What's the glove arm doing during this whole process, right? We've kind of talked about the center of the body, the pelvis, the torso. We've kind of talked about what's going on during that load, linear move and then unload. But what's the arm doing during this whole period? So I think this is a good view to see this from. We really like to refer to the initial arm swing. I do like the analogy of the spiral staircase that most of you guys have heard, where that arm swings up this imaginary spiral staircase to get up, right? It's not just lifting that arm into a high cock position, right? That's not what most high-level throwers do, is there's some sort of spiraling action to get the arm up, whether it's a little bit more extended here to come up or it's a little bit more kind of elbow driven. There's a spiraling action to get the arm up. But what we like to use as a cue is float the arm into position. Because what happens is when guys get too tense too early from the upper half, right, there's all these different components that have to happen. Energy has to build from the lower half before you can actually bring the arm into the throw. And so when guys from the very start begin to tense from their arm. Maybe they have an aggressive stab from their arm action. Maybe they immediately bring that hand to the ear. When you start to get too tense from the arm too early, we call it hijacking the throw, hijacking the flow of energy. All this energy from the lower half that you're trying to delay the arm coming into the throw too soon. So when you bring the arm into the throw too soon, you never actually access the full wave of energy, the full potential energy that you have from the ground, from the hips, from the lower half, from the torso. So the arm action should actually be floating during this time. So as he gets into his lower half, there's not an active contribution from the arm. The arm is floating up into position, and you can see that there's very little tension through his arm. So again, just watch the free and easy position that his arm flows through during that lower half move. He's just letting the hand separate and float into position. He's not aggressively separating them. He's letting them float into position so that at the right time, this is the key. This is why floating the arm is a very good cue. The point of the arm action is to not come into the throw until this energy has been blocked by the front leg and that rotation has wound its way up the torso. The arm is basically just trying to get up and in a good position at landing so that as the torso begins to rotate, it's in a good position to accept that violent layback. So the arm comes in to the throw too soon, rather, it's not in a good position to adequately capture all this energy. So he's not bringing the arm into the throw too soon, he's floating it into position. And then another key to look at is that he's getting into this kind of scap loaded position that people talk about. But again, scap loading isn't just yanking the arms behind the body actively. Scap loading is floating the arm up the staircase, and it's naturally going to get up and back and behind the body. So this is scap loading. It's the arms being back behind the midline of the body at landing, and it's having this daylight between the arm and the head. Right here's the head. There's all this daylight between the head and the arm. So that's great. That's what we look for. And this creates this big stretch through the pecs. It creates a stretch through the glove side pec. It creates a stretch through the throwing arm pec. And as soon as that energy actually does make it into the arm, there's this huge pull through the chest. So the torso goes, the arm gets up. As the torso goes, it creates this rubber band-like effect through the chest, and that slingshots the arm through. So there's this pull, the arm lags behind a hair, pec pulls, and then the pec fires. So it's the slingshot effect. Very similar effect happening at the lat. Lat and the pec are the two, big accelerators of the arm. And so by being able to get into this position, he's in a really good position to accelerate that arm into ball release. He's captured all this kinetic energy. Now the arm augments that rotation. It adds to that rotation actively. There's already all this energy flowing through from the rest of the body. Now the arm matches that and actively comes into the throw from landing into ball release. So from here to there, don't be mistaken, he's very actively trying to throw the crap out of the ball. He's capturing that stretch through the chest, and he's slingshotting from the pec, from the lat, and pulling as hard as he can in the ball release. Now you can tell this is happening because where is his arm at ball release? If you draw a straight line through the shoulders, through the acromial line, you should see the elbow, the wrist, the ball. You should see them roughly in a straight line. You should see the elbow roughly straight at ball release. When you see guys, maybe their elbow is out in front at release, maybe their elbow is bent at release, that's a sign that they're not allowing that energy to unfurl, and they're not pulling into ball release, but rather they're pushing into ball release. And so what you'll see with a lot of slow throwing athletes is that they'll release with a bent arm, and from a side view, they'll release with that elbow out in front of their nose versus the arm straight and in line with their body. So again, just telltale sign that he's got very high level patterns. He's utilizing the big muscles of his upper body. He's delaying bringing the arm into the throw too soon. And the final thing I want to point out, it does link to the previous point, is just that he has a very what we call well-timed intent. Now, intent is kind of this buzzword that's been around for a while. Coaches will say intent. Well, what they really mean is this rotational violence, or this intent to throw the ball hard. But what happens when a lot of athletes hear the word intent and the coaches just pull out a radar gun, pull out weighted balls, and say throw as hard as you can, is it doesn't necessarily lead to this optimal energy transfer if just left uncoached and you just tell a kid to throw with intent. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the kid already has great sequencing. He knows not to bring the arm into the throw too soon. But a lot of times it leads to what we already talked about. The arm starts to tense early, and the arm takes over the throw before letting that energy actually flow from the lower half into the upper half. And so we call it well-timed intent. Well-timed intensity is letting this wave-like energy flow through the entire body before you bring the arm into the throw. And so if you're a coach, if you're an athlete, pay attention to this during your catch play, right? If you're doing long toss, if you're doing plyo care drills, if you're just doing catch play, this is something that regardless of what your exact approach is, you can still work on timing that intent to be late, to be relaxed, to be free, to be easy. A really good tip that I got from an old clip of Billy Wagner talking is he said, you know, how he learned to throw 100 miles an hour was he would constantly just be trying to throw hard, easy every day. So even if he's warming up, even if he's just tossing the ball, if it's a low effort day, a high effort day, if it's a long toss, he's working his way out. He's trying to create that arm speed from the rest of his body. He's trying to bring the arm into the throw as late as possible, and he's trying to throw hard, easy. He's trying to get that ball, get some carry on it, get some zip on it, without feeling like he has to actively bring the arm into the throw. So if you're going out to long toss, see how far you can get using your pelvis, using your torso to throw the ball. Only bring the arm into the throw once you get out to the max distance that you can, from the rest of the body. Maybe you can long toss 100 yards. Maybe you're on a long toss program. But maybe you can get out to 85 yards before you actually feel like you're bringing the arm into the throw. The arm is going to be there. That active effort from the pec and the lat will be there when you need it at 100%. But as you warm up, as you go through catch play, can my first throws be 5% effort from the arm? I'm really just using the lower half, feeling the kinetic chain work. So that would be my biggest tip for how I personally learned to throw hard, is trying to throw hard easy, right? If you already have pretty good patterns, you already maybe throw 93, 94, and you're trying to figure out how to gain a mile an hour or two, sometimes it isn't actually changing gross movement patterns. Sometimes it's just being able to seamlessly connect the movement patterns you already have. High velocity throwers can basically minimize the energy lost segment to segment through the kinetic chain. It's not about necessarily getting 5 degrees more separation, or sometimes it can be. Sometimes it can be these measurable gross movement changes, but a lot of times it's taking the patterns you already have and streamlining them. It's being able to move smoothly and seamlessly and connect those different segments through your body to where it's as smooth an energy transfer as possible. It's why you see guys that look like they're throwing so effortlessly, but they're throwing 100 miles an hour. It's why you see a guy like Dustin May, it looks effortless, it's 100 miles an hour. It's not effortless, it's just well-timed intent. And so that's the key distinction to take away from this video into your own training, into your own coaching with your athletes. Guys, thanks for watching this video. Had a lot of fun doing this one. There's a lot more where this came from coming up this month. If you like this video, if you maybe want some of your athletes or you want your own mechanics broken down, that is an offering that we do as a company. Definitely make sure to click the link below and shoot us an email if that's something that you're interested in. We also do online mentorship and development programs. We've coached over 1,000 athletes in the past 5 years. We've had 28 athletes drafted of ours in the past 3 years. And we've coached over a dozen big leaguers through that time as well. So if you're interested in any of that at all, if you're struggling with anything in particular with your own training, your own career, your own coaching, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. We pride ourselves on being extremely responsive and being extremely helpful. So shoot us an email if you're curious. If you have any suggestions for future big leaguers to do breakdowns of, anyone you're just really curious to see how they are able to generate that velocity, leave a comment down below and we'll be sure to read them as well. So thanks again for watching. Had a lot of fun doing this, and I will see you in the next video.